Welcome back to another chilling night of tales. I was a serial killer's babysitter. It was the summer of 1999. In our little town of Hope Valley in western Maryland, the scariest things we could imagine were Y2K, The Sixth Sense, and the Blair Witch Project. I mean, Burkittsville was only about 25 miles away. Those kids looked just like us, and the film they shot was almost as poor quality as our AV club. Nobody told us it wasn't real, and nobody told us there was a serial killer in our county. We had to figure both of those things out for ourselves. I blame the police for the fact that nobody knew, but the reporters at the Herald played a big part in confusing and distorting what facts there were. By the time September rolled around and school started, there had been 4 murders in 3 months. Most people only knew about 2 of them, though. The paper reported them as suicides over a business deal gone wrong, so nobody paid much attention. I was starting the 11th grade and could not have cared less. I was obsessed with Anthony Kiedis, Dave Grohl, and saving up enough money to get into a good university far, far away. Babysitting was my mission. I won't bore you with the details. Suffice to say, I had it down to a science, and I always had as much business as I could handle. I had to stay home with my sisters when my parents went bowling, so on Fridays, I ran a drop-off service. The first Friday of that school year, I had 2 new kids. One was Asha Mason, our new neighbor's sweet, severely asthmatic 3-year-old. The other was 4-year-old Bradley Vale from further down the street. Not so sweet, but nothing I couldn't handle. Bradley came with an unexpected extra, the Vale's Greek exchange student. "Allison," Mrs. Vale said. "You know Nicholas, don't you?" Our school was tiny. She knew I did. My eyes narrowed. "What's up, Nick?" I asked. He told everyone he went by Nico with a long E sound at home, but we all just called him Nick. "He's only been in the country a few months," Mrs. Vale said, "and we don't like to leave him at home all by himself. He won't be any trouble. You don't mind if he stays here with Bradley, do you?" Nick had enough sense to look ashamed. I thought about it, then held out my hand. $20 and $1 every 5 minutes if you're late, just like Bradley. She hesitated. "Take it or leave it." Sounds harsh, but in this business it's the only way. She handed me a $20, like it was her last savings, and walked off without a word. Nick was actually good with the kids. Even better, my sisters thought he was weird, so we hardly saw them the whole time. He mostly kept to himself, working in his battered sketchbook. I noticed his English was a lot better than he let on at school, and I asked him about it as I cut carrots for the kids' dinner. "Well, my English isn't perfect," he said, "so if I pretend it's a lot worse, it saves embarrassment when I make a mistake, yeah." He was standing by the dining room window. "I wonder why your neighbor leaves all his lights on while the daughter is with you and they go out." It did look like every light in their house was on. I shrugged. "As long as they pay me at the end of the night, that's all that matters." "Maybe they went out to the disco. Do you like to go to Disco Alley? My uncle knows all the best discos in Washington, D.C. He started doing some kind of bizarre Euro dance moves." "Nick, just set the table, please, and go pause the VHS." He was weird, but like harmless weird. He genuinely cared for Bradley, and he didn't try to make a move on me or anything. Still, I was glad when they were all gone. Most of my friends were probably out spending money somewhere, and here I was, $70 richer. In those days, that would buy a college textbook with change left over. Asha was back the following Friday, and so was Bradley. After her previous performance, I had to yank Mrs. Vale's chain just a little. "Nick doesn't need a sitter tonight?" She sighed. "No, he's with his uncle in D.C. this weekend." She obviously disapproved of the uncle, the situation, or both. It was a normal, boring, slow, totally average weekend for everyone in our little boring town. Everyone, that is, except the lady who was found dead in her garage Saturday morning, rolled up tight in a heavy plastic tarp where she'd suffocated. People were talking about it in the school hallway on Monday. "Did you know the police are calling it suicide?" Jeremy Tanner was saying. That kid loved to hear himself talk. Who the F commits suicide by rolling themselves up in plastic and not trying to roll back out? Everyone had an opinion to add. She got stuck. It was her husband. A boyfriend, the mob. I bet she smoked the cocaine. The lady was a county commissioner or official of some kind. Who knows what people with positions like that get themselves into? I just shook my head and went on to my first class. Later that week, the 2 deaths the Herald had reported in August came back into the rumor mill. One of the men, who had owned a trucking company, was found drowned in a big bucket of white paint. The other, an investment banker, had been found hanged in his attic with a chalk line. Like the dead lady, both victims were found in their own homes on a late Friday or early Saturday. Their families were at home, nobody heard anything, and there were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. These details hadn't been in the paper. They came courtesy of another school bigmuth, Trevor Maines, whose dad was an assistant coroner. And there's more. Trevor told our whole lunch table. In July, they found a guy who'd burned through the roof of his mouth with a propane torch. And before that, in June, this other guy died with a socket wrench extender pushed through his eyeball and into his brain. Leslie Peters choked on her soda. None of us believed him. Both the first 2 guys were rich as crap, and their families kept their deaths quiet, he went on. They're in the police records, look them up. But this is the really messed up part. All 5 of these deaths recorded as suicide. I'm not joking. That's what the reports say. My dad doesn't buy it, but they don't listen to him. He thinks somebody's covering something up. Like what? Jeremy asked. I bet it was some kind of turf war over drugs. Trevor rolled his eyes. Man, this ain't law and order up in here. There was 0 evidence of an attacker in all 5 cases. I sneaked in my dad's study and looked at the actual reports. But you just can't do this kind of stuff to yourself. A blowtorch in your own mouth, are you serious? Trevor lowered his voice and looked around. Nobody on the force believes it either. They say it's either a professional or a serial killer who knows an awful lot about cleaning up a work site. Jeremy nodded. A professional. That's how the drug kingpins do it. But hold on, Trevor said. A professional is gonna bring his own weapon, right? He's not going to leave it to chance. These people were all killed with common tools lying around in their own houses. All the tools and stuff belong to the dead people. He let that sink in. Sheriff's office even has a name for him now. Everyone was quiet. They call him the handyman killer. I thought that was pretty corny, but people loved it. The name and the prospect of a Hope Valley area serial killer were all over town in less than a day. Rumors and gossip were out of control. I knew one thing for sure. I would not have wanted to be a handyman anywhere in Washington County that week. Friday evening came as usual for mid-September, with the distant, visceral roar of supercharged engines at Hagerstown Speedway floating gently on the warm breeze. Bradley and Nick walked over on their own that day. Nick shrugged and handed me the cash for both of them. "I'll just sketch at the table, okay?" he asked. "Far out," I replied, and let them in while I waited for Asha. Her mom fussed over the child's inhaler and chamber combo. "It's okay," I reassured her. "We'll do it twice tonight, and I know she'll be a big girl and breathe in all of her medicine. Want you, sweetheart?" I took Asha and her bag of supplies inside. After sundown, I noticed Nick staring out the window toward the neighbor's house. "Allie, why do you think they leave all the lights on?" he asked me. "Nobody at my home would do this. It's just weird." Speak for yourself, I thought. But all I said was, maybe they're afraid of burglars. Nick shook his head. "No, with burglars, the outside light is best. But they don't have outside lights on, only inside." I went back to getting Asha's inhaler ready. Nick stood up. "It's really weird, you know. I'm going to have a look." "Nick, you can't just go in someone's yard and peek in their windows." "I'm too curious now to do drawings and homework. Just a little look." Nick went out the patio door without another word. "No, come back," I called after him. No answer. "At least close the door." Asha stared silently out the window during her treatment, and after. She ignored my attempts to interest the kids in a game of perfection until Nick came back. He sat down next to me on the sofa, his eyes wide. "So weird," he said in a low voice. "Your neighbor is there, in his basement. Just him in this little room where he stands, making these kinds of moves. Nick stood up and tried to show me what he'd seen. Like he's doing Tai Chi? Nick didn't answer. You know, it's this series of moves you do. I know what Tai Chi is, Nick snapped. I'm from Athens, not Albania. But that's not the same as what your neighbor does. Outside the house, though, there was something else. Nick stared over my shoulder. Like somebody was out there, watching me, but couldn't be seen, calling to me. But I couldn't hear, like a bad dream, you know. I didn't want to hear, so I got out of there. The doorbell rang just then, and Nick almost jumped out of his skin. I laughed at him and went to the door. Asha's dad had come to pick her up early. Allison, he asked as I gathered her things. We came back to our house on the way here, and I thought I caught a glimpse of somebody in the yard. About a foot taller than you, maybe. Have you seen anything unusual outside? I tried to hide my mortification by looking around toward the dining room window. Nick was nowhere in sight. No, I haven't, I said. It would be perfectly natural to sound nervous, I thought, after hearing somebody was prowling around outside. But I'll definitely watch out, that's creepy. Nick was only a couple inches taller than me, but I wasn't going to argue the point. You do that, he said. There have been some weird things going on lately. He was looking toward our back hallway, but didn't say anything more. I told him Asha had been super good and had taken her inhaler twice, and they went home. Nick came out of the bathroom a minute later and started picking up his books and Bradley's things. That guy is really weird, Nick said, looking out the window. Do not trust him. We're going now, too. I heard Bradley crying all the way down the block as they walked home. The handyman killer was still on everyone's mind the next week, but after days of aimless speculation, the rumors died down. The next weekend went just the same as the last, except that I threatened to tell Mrs. Vale if Nick so much as thought about going outside. October came, bringing a welcome change from the summer heat and another Friday night, without Nick this time, courtesy of his uncle in D.C. That Sunday after dinner, Dad excitedly called us all into the family room. Guys, look, we're on the Channel 4 news. Jim Vance is talking about Hope Valley right now. Come on! Our familiar evening news anchor was narrating a full-screen video taken from a helicopter earlier that day. The video showed a big mansion with expansive grounds and horses in the pasture. According to local police, Vance was saying, the man was a fund manager with ties to real estate agencies and several local charities. He was found this morning in his home by his family when they returned from a vacation. Dead in an apparent drill. Handyman killer hammers the wealthy. Are police doing their level best? The front page of the Herald screamed on Monday, and that was the reputable paper. The sheriff's office issued an official statement that there was no serial killer, but nobody believed it, especially not the students. Among the theories was one that sent chills up my spine. A couple of the guys had started asking a lot of questions about Nick dying. Like, when exactly did he come to the U.S. that summer, and where had he been during each murder? The police stuck by suicide or accident in each case, but everyone called it murder. Some kids were even starting to call Nick Dracula behind his back. I was scared for Nick. I knew from talking to him that he'd come to stay with the Vales at the very beginning of June, before the first murder happened. And I knew that he'd been away with his uncle on the days when at least 2 of the newest murders went down. I thought he was kind of weird, like I said, but I didn't think he was a killer. I caught up to him in the hallway between classes. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, he said when I told him. For one, why would I do such things as these killings? And 2, why Dracula? Transylvanian people speak Hungarian. It's nothing at all like Greek, and a totally different accent when speaking English. I didn't say I heard it from intelligent people, I said. Just be careful. Try to be more normal. Everyone's afraid of the unknown right now, okay? I'm just telling you all this as a favor because, I make money off you. Be more normal, he sighed. Ugh. Right then and there, Nick turned and bumped into Anna Schneider, knocking her books to the floor. Ah, so sorry, he exclaimed. Kids started staring as he picked up her books and placed them in her hands. He looked down at her and said, Oh, Anna, I could be lost forever. staring into the infinity of your cleavages. People were laughing, and Anna stared at him with her mouth open. I had to do something. Eyes, I said as I stepped up beside them. The English word is eyes? That's what you meant, right, Nick? Her eyes? Nick put his hand to his forehead. Oh yes, that's the word I meant, Anna. Your eyes so round and beautiful. And sorry for knocking down your books. See you later. I walked beside him a little ways. Now they see that I'm a regular guy, ally. I'm not so weird, right? Maybe, I guess. It might go better if you didn't overdo the accent so much. You want to seem normal, not stick out even more. So, you like that girl, Anna? Like her? No, that was just for show. She looks like a Turkish peasant with yellow hair. Uh-huh. So who is your type around here? You definitely never act like that around me. Nick shrugged. I like the girls who have big eyes. The week went by, and nobody came out accusing Nick of being a mass murderer. Friday brought Asha, Bradley, and Nick back to my house. And Nick had a laptop computer along with his sketchbook. I'm doing my own research about these killings, he said. It was an uneventful evening until, after her second inhaler treatment, Asha went to the window that faced her house. Ballman, she said. Ballman is there. She pointed and coughed. Nick jumped to her side and peered out into the darkness between the houses. I went over too, but couldn't see anything. I'll go turn the light off so we can see better, I said. No, Nick yelled. Allie, I feel something watching, like the other night. Put all the lights on in the house now. Asha, come with Uncle Nico and watch a movie. He seemed seriously freaked out, so I went around the house turning lights on for him. I yelled into the basement for my sisters to turn on more lights down there and walked into my parents' bedroom. The room was dark except for fingers of moonlight that reached through the blinds to paint pale stripes across the floor. It was quiet. I shivered in the sudden coolness of the air. I took 2 steps toward the nearest bedside lamp and stopped. My skin was all over goosebumps. I was being watched, regarded, I thought to myself, by something vast and unseen. There was no sound from the hallway or the living room beyond, just a faint, spiraling, rasping buzz, coming as if from just beyond the edge of perception. I listened closely and thought I could make out 2 separate tones. My bare feet were so cold. I concentrated. My whole body shivered. I strained to hear. I closed my eyes. 2 tones. Syllables. 2 syllables. My hands clenched in the cold, fingernails digging deep into my palms. Lights, I heard, or thought I did. I held my breath. Lights out. Fear overcame fascination, and I screamed and dove for the bedside lamp. I stumbled against the table and ran face first into the bedpost, but I managed to turn on the light before I fell. I was sitting on the floor when Nick raced in with Bradley right behind him. Nick looked concerned, but Bradley just laughed and pointed and said, Miss Allison hurt herself. I almost said, no big deal, I just stumbled in the dark, and left it at that. It would be my normal way to handle anything, just shrug it off and keep going. Instead, I said, Nick, tell me again about what you saw outside the neighbor's house. I wasn't convinced that what he said he saw was real, but I suddenly wasn't so sure he was making it up either. I set the kids up to watch Anastasia again while Nick and I talked at the table. As we did, I found my gaze turning again toward the window and the light blazing out of the house next door. The sensation of being watched was gone, but I still felt cold. In the little bit of time we had left that evening, we made our plans. Nick wanted to keep researching the killings. He took it personally that people were trying to connect him to them. I was more interested in learning about who our neighbors really were and about what Nick and I might have experienced. Part of my job was to observe the neighbor's house during the week. Watching their windows from Saturday through Thursday, I saw that they only put on what looked like a normal amount of lights. Some nights I had to walk past their property on my way home from a babysitting gig. I moved slowly through the pool of light around their front yard lamp and on into the shadowed area at the border between our lawns. The sharp autumn breeze carried a soft incense of wet leaves and cold earth. I heard a handful of late singing crickets and the echo of a barking dog. Normal sounds of a little town just past the end of summer. I didn't have a sense of being watched on those nights, and didn't feel anything other than the chill of the evening. I was headed toward Nick's locker on Wednesday to compare notes when I saw him surrounded by Jeremy Tanner and 3 of his farm kid buddies. "Hey, Dracula," Jeremy was saying. "Who you gonna kill this Friday, huh? Why don't you do us a favor and take out Principal Stevens this time?" Nick's posture was relaxed, like this happened every day. He rolled his eyes and said, "I am from Athens. There's no Greek name. Dracula, okay? This Friday, I go to Club Nation in D.C. Fridays, they have a big dance party, Kubik. You know it? All the best club music. Only thing I might kill is girls who have exhaustion from dancing with me." Nick started an impromptu dance demo right there in the hall, beatboxing and flexing his arms and legs and thrusting with his hips. I couldn't help laughing at the boys' confused expressions as they backed away from Nick like he might be contagious. "If you guys think you can handle it," Nick said as he slung his backpack over one shoulder. "My uncle can get us in the club. You won't even need fake ID. Meet some girls there from Sofia. You might never want to come back to this place again." He shook one hand in the air like he burned it on a hot stove. "We're watching you, Drac," Jeremy said as his boys retreated. "Next time you strike, you better be looking over your shoulder." "Those were some, pretty sweet moves," I said after the spectacle was over. "So, you're going out of town this weekend?" "No, Ali, that's just a story for them. I'm not going. The Vales will know I'm here, and you, but nobody else. Not for just babysitting, though. For a recon operation." "Uh-huh. You're going to sneak around the neighbor's house again?" "Yes, I've found some things. All the dead people have some business with each other. I think they all have one big thing in common, but the internet just gives hints. Tomorrow, I'm skipping school so Mr. Vale can take me to the Hagerstown Library. I'll have all day at the archives while... All I've dug up is that he used to own a building company years ago, but it went bankrupt and now he works for another firm. The only other thing is just something I didn't find. There was no birth announcement in the paper for Asha. I mean, I guess not everybody does that, but they live... Could be interesting. I'll look for that too. What about the lights in the house? Did you go up close?" "Nothing out of the ordinary. I guess we'll see what happens on Friday. Hope nobody dies while you're out of school tomorrow?" Nick laughed. "They better not. It would break my theory." "Well, I hope your theory is worth missing your date with Sofia this weekend." He laughed again. "Sofia's a city, not a person. Bulgarian capital. Girls from there grew up Soviet. Now they are free and they really like to party. You could learn some things from them, Ali." Thanks, but no thanks. Let me know what you find out at the library." Friday was a quiet day at school. I skipped lunch to talk with Nick in the school library. There was a huge scandal that barely made the news at all, Nick told me. He'd made photocopies of everything he found. 5 years ago, a big new development was planned, with a new school and a firehouse and everything. It was going to go here. He pointed to a map of an area near the city. Well, all the money went in and nothing came out. Everybody involved got away clean except one construction company that got all the blame. Guess which one? My neighbor's company. Yes, they lost everything and the husband went to jail. Now, here is the other thing I found. When he went to jail, the wife was pregnant. He was still in jail when the child was born, and they had no health insurance. This was why there was never a birth announcement. Nick handed me another photocopy from almost 4 years ago. I started reading aloud. Adele Lane Mason passed peacefully in the arms of her loving mother on November 22, 1995, a short time after being born without functioning lungs. During her brief time on Earth, she was loved deeply by family and friends. I trailed off and looked up at Nick. Asha's birthday is coming up on November 22. She'll be 4 years old. But if their daughter died, was she a twin? Nick shook his head. That's all there is. No record of another child for them at all. Just a dead infant named Adele. And here they are with Asha, the same age with no birth record, at least not publicly. I shook my head. There must be some explanation, but that leaves 2 heartbroken parents who might have blamed the child's death on the people who also ruined their business. If you ignore the other stuff, that's enough to drive some people to murder right there. Nick looked thoughtful. He reached into his backpack. Yes, but can you ignore the other stuff? Remember what happened to you in your house, and tell me what you think of this. Nick had opened his sketchbook and placed it in front of me. The entire page was dark with graphite. The walls, floor, ceiling, and bed were all distinguished only by subtle textures, except for a few bright bars on the carpet where light came in through the blinds. I made out a figure beside the bed, its hands outstretched but balled into fists. I could tell from the hair it was me. Behind the bed, there was something else. Shaded into the other textures was the faint outline of a massive shape that loomed over the scene. Its arms stretched down below the level of the bed, and a lump of undefined masses formed its head. I knew it was the head because there were 5 slightly lighter spots for its eyes, but it had no mouth. I shivered violently and pushed the book back toward Nick. Nick, I was sitting by the bed with the light on when you came into the room. How did you know where I was standing and what the room looked like in the dark? When I went to your neighbor's house that night, I felt something touch my mind, Nick said. I ran, but too late. I see things now I didn't see before. That was the vision I saw at the moment I heard you scream. He flipped some pages and pushed the sketchbook back toward me. This is what I drew after the night at your neighbor's house. The shading wasn't as detailed as the drawing of the room. A small human figure stood near a house at night, silhouetted in the bright white squares of its windows. The figure cast a shadow that was slightly darker than the textures of the lawn and the walls, and the clouds and the woods. A dark, blurry shape coiled against the eaves of the house above the figure. 5 tiny, almond-shaped lighter areas marked its eyes. I shivered again and pushed the book away. Oh, so you drew that after going over there, and now you're just going to go back like it's no big deal. What do you even hope to find? Tonight, Nick said, I'll bring Mr. Vale's video camera. I'm going to record the man doing his rituals, and anything else I see. You're not thinking about going inside, are you? You better not do a B&E over there. Nick put up his hand. Of course I won't go in the house. Not as long as anybody's home, anyway. You are not going to go in there, Nick, I warned him. Do you think the video will show something you can't see? What kind of ritual is he doing down there? Allie, how should I know what ritual? I'm not a mountain person who follows every superstition back to the day of Abraham. I'm taking the video because my uncle knows people who might know. As for what it shows, he made a gesture with his thumb and first 2 fingers across his body. Pray it only. Asha, Bradley, and Nick were all at my house that evening. Every indoor light we had was on by nightfall, just like at the neighbor's house. Nick loaded a fresh video cassette into Mr. Val's camera and checked the battery level. He put on a serious expression and turned the lens on himself. Testing, testing, Raiders Brigade operation, this weird house commencing now. He smiled at himself, adjusted the sound levels, gave me a wink, and went out into the dark backyard. I checked how much time had elapsed on the kids' Sesame Street video and went to stand in the open doorway. The cold breeze blew right through my sweatshirt, and I wrapped my arms around myself. Hazy clouds covered the sky, reflecting almost no city light. The brightly lit windows of the neighbor's house floated in the night air like beacons in a far harbor. Rattling leaves in the trees overhead were the only sound. The edge of the metal sliding door track was sharp and cold through my thin socks, but I wasn't budging until Nick came back. I saw movement by the neighbor's house. It was Nick, creeping silently toward a basement window. I watched him bend down to look inside. He began to raise the camera, then stopped halfway. He stood in that position, in a half crouch with the camera at hip level, for what felt like a full minute. Nick, psst, I shouted. I didn't know if he could hear me, but I didn't want to yell. I said his name again, a little louder. He didn't move. For a split second, I saw Nick in sharp focus. His face was turned toward me, and he was pale and shaking. Then the air around him darkened, as though a lens had passed between us. Nick, Nick. I called out. I heard the camera fall to the ground. His shadow passed across a window, heading toward the back of the house. Nick, I yelled, and stepped out onto the cold concrete of the patio. A low, rasping sound like what I'd heard in my parents' bedroom came to me faintly across the lawn. My stomach lurched. I ran to the edge of the patio and yelled for Nick. I heard glass break around the far corner. Seconds later, the light in the neighbor's back room went out. Without stopping to think, I ran toward the house. The insectile rasping grew louder, punctuated by the crunch of brittle grass under my feet. Ahead of me, another window went dark. Was Nick doing that? As I passed the shrubs that bordered our yard, a light flashed behind the window, and I heard a gunshot. The buzzing sound erupted in a roar, and a woman screamed inside the house. The scream ended in a strangled shriek, and something heavy crashed to the floor inside. I shouted again and ran for the rear door. Instinct made me glance over my shoulder. I saw Asha standing at the dining room window, her eyes wide and bright. I had just enough time to hope she stayed inside before I reached the neighbor's back door. I burst through the open door and blundered through the dark washroom, still calling for Nick. Just as I reached the hallway, the last light on my floor of the house went out. The buzzing was getting louder. I heard a door open and close by and shied away from it into the living room. Panicked, I reached for the light switch. The wall beside me dripped with blood. A pump shotgun lay on the beige shag carpet beside Mrs. Mason's dead body. Her face-down position almost looked natural until I saw that her head had been twisted all the way around to face the ceiling. I screamed and ran back out into the hallway, trying to orient myself. Over the buzzing sound and the blood rushing in my ears, I heard a loud thump downstairs. I went to the open door and looked down into the basement. "Nick, answer me," I shouted in a ragged voice that I barely recognized as my own. The basement had gone dark, and there didn't seem to be a light switch in the stairwell. The constant, repetitive buzzing noise now seemed to rise from the black depth ahead of me. Holding the rail tightly, I started down. I was scared and overwhelmed by what I'd seen. But I knew Nick was down there somewhere, and I couldn't leave him. Partway down the steps, I heard a door open in the basement. Light swept over a concrete floor littered with tools and building materials, and Mr. Mason's voice rang out. "Who disturbs the chamber of summons and command?" The voice that answered was Nick's, but nothing like his voice at the same time. It was as though the interminable, grating buzz poured through Nick's body, his human throat giving it the fleeting form of language. "Baal is come." Near the bottom of the stairs, I slipped in something wet and fell the rest of the way. "You work for me. You can't pass the threshold," Mr. Mason yelled. I looked up and saw Nick's familiar shape in the doorway, surrounded by an ashy penumbra that seemed to increase his height and bulk. "This flesh do pass," the not Nick voice rasped as he stepped through the door. The light went out, plunging the basement into total darkness. "Nick!" I shouted, struggling to stand and make my way toward him. "Nick, come back!" A crash of splintering wood came from the room ahead, and Mr. Mason started screaming. His high-pitched wail of anguish and desolation drowned out the continuous, maddening buzzing. I stumbled in the dark, fell again, and lay there stunned. I curled up on the dusty floor, trembling and covering my ears. A series of sharp mechanical bangs rang out, and Mr. Mason's scream ended in a gurgling wheeze. The swarming sound began to ebb. I wanted so much to run, to get out, but I couldn't leave Nick. I forced myself up and crawled the rest of the way to the doorway, sobbing his name. In the room, I heard a man's labored breathing. I fumbled for the light switch, thinking somehow the light would make me safe. The wall felt warm and tacky, but I kept reaching until I found the switch and turned on the light. In the flickering fluorescent glare, I saw Nick standing over Mr. Mason's body, half facing me. His left shoulder was a bleeding mass of flayed tissue and gore where the shotgun blast must have struck him. His face was tight, his expression empty. A cloud of darkness pulsated around him, fading in and out in a slow rhythm. Splashes of fresh blood speckled the walls all around. As I watched, stunned, Nick planted one knee on Mr. Mason's chest and reached out to the high window with his right hand, palm out. The rasping noise welled up again and surged through his lips. Ash, rah. At that moment, a sickly yellow twist of luminescence seemed to flow from Mr. Mason, through Nick's tortured body, and out the window. Nick slumped backward, his foot sliding in the pool of blood that was spreading around Mr. Mason. "Nick, what's happening?" I cried and moved toward him. Nick's head turned, but his eyes weren't tracking. The darkness grew around him. His mouth opened, and the droning sound intensified into an unintelligible, croaking chant. I heard the words flesh and corruption mixed with some other language. I was transfixed, unable to move. Nick picked up the big nail gun that lay on the floor beside him. I watched, helpless, as it swung toward me. "Nick, please," I whispered. The darkness around him wavered, and for just a moment, his eyes came up to meet mine. He looked so sad. The nail gun swung faster, passing me and curling around to rest against his face. I screamed and reached out, but I couldn't get to him in time. He pulled the trigger. As the darkness evaporated and the awful sound weakened, I crawled to Nick and fell on top of him, shouting his name. He gasped, and then spoke for the last time in his own voice. "The last page. Stop her, Ellie. She has the child's soul." Then blood fountained from his sinus and his eyes glazed. "What do you mean?" I yelled. "Stop who? Damn it, Nick, you can't die." I wept and pounded on his chest and shouted his name over and over and over. As I gasped for breath, I heard a sound that froze my heart. The merry, bubbling laughter of a little girl floated through the cellar window. I looked up and saw Asha watching us, her hands on the glass. Her giggle was loud and clear, with no hint of a cough. She waved at me. The last thing I remember from that night is the sight of her little blonde curls disappearing into the dark. They told me they found me on the floor of my bedroom, my hands and face and clothes smeared with blood, rocking back and forth with Nick's sketchbook clutched to my chest. It's been almost 19 years since that night. I was released from the psychiatric facility a month ago, and I think I've just about gotten the hang of this smartphone. It's amazing to me how much you can learn in a few days with a handful of apps. The first thing I looked for at home was the sketchbook. It was worn, and its covers were spotted with blood, but to me, it was worth more than all of my old cash savings and concert relics put together. I opened it on my bed and flipped anxiously toward the last page. I was certain that was what he'd meant when he said, "the last page," that I needed to look at his last drawing. Nick's next to last sketch made my heart skip a beat. It was a pair of eyes, drawn so large they filled the page. I recognized them immediately. They were mine. My freckles have long since faded, and my lashes have thinned out. But Nick drew me exactly as I was then, and I recognized him in the slim figure reflected in the delicately shaded iris. The last sketch in his book was a tangle of thick, dark shading that outlined a shaft or pole of some kind. A crude, voluptuous figure stood with one arm and one leg curled around the pole, and 5 smudged, almond-shaped eyes opened like sores in the unevenly shaded darkness around them. In all of my online searches and my day spent at the archives, I don't think the paper archives are what they used to be, but I tried them. I never found a single mention of Asha Mason. I even looked up Trevor Maines, hoping he could help, but he'd gone into the Navy and then other industries, and has no official connections anymore. I finally found her on Facebook. She isn't named on the page or in the photo captions or comments, but she's in several photos, and even 2 decades later, there's no doubt it's Asha. She's the mysterious leader of a new cult called Ashera, American Sensual Hedonic Ecstasy Rites of Ascension. Their logo is a pole-dancing cartoon woman ringed by a circle of 5 elongated stars. This weekend I have been scouting their compound in the mountains of West Virginia, where there isn't much cell service. That fact will work to my advantage when the moment comes. I'm sitting in my truck on a dirt trail off the main road, waiting for the sun to go down and for their open field ritual to start farther up the mountain. On the seat beside me are a high-powered LED lantern and the heavy framing nail gun I bought with my university fund money. Nick's sketchbook is in my lap, and I've been paging slowly through it as I write this last update, remembering his humor and his courage. If I can hold on to those things in my heart, and maybe his dance moves too, I'll be able to get close enough to her to do what I need to do. For gentle Nick, who I wish I'd known better and longer. And for Adele, who never got to live and needs to go free, I'm going to fix the handyman killer's terrible, botched job tonight.